Technology, Policy, and Ethics Lecture Series. Thank you all for coming today. First, let me thank the College of Liberal Arts and the Philosophy Department for providing funding for these events, without which we wouldn't have these conversations. And a special thank you to the College of Business, who's a special sponsor for this one. So, our topic today is on the ethics of surveillance drones. We've been hearing about military drones every week, not daily, in the news, and the same kinds of robots are making their way back into society. So our speaker today, Ryan Calo, will be talking about this trend as well as the implication on our American values. So Ryan is the Director of Privacy and Robotics at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. This fall, he's going to be starting a new gig as a law professor at University of Washington Law School. As an undergrad, he was a philosophy major at Dartmouth College, and then he turned to the dark side and went to law school at University of Michigan. So I met Ryan a few years ago because we both work at Robot Ethics. He's the go-to guy for the media whenever they want to comment on technology and privacy. So you might have seen him quoted in things like the Wall Street Journal, New York Times. Last week there was a great write-up about him in our local New Times, which I think is still on the stands. Yesterday he had a great article out on Huffington Post called 10 Minutes About Drones. And more importantly, Ryan has a chapter on privacy in our latest and most awesome robot ethics book from MIT Press that just came out not too long ago. So with that, let me turn over the stage to Ryan, and please join me in welcoming him to CalPoly.
Thanks very much, Professor Lin. It's really exciting for me to be here. Could everybody hear me okay? All right? Yeah? Yes, no? Not really? Let me move this guy up. How about now? A little better?
Better.
Better, not great? Okay? Yeah, okay, good. Because I have to have this big booming voice because of this sort of dictator setup that we have here. There's an enormous screen in the back. Maybe. Yeah, so I'm so excited to be here. As Patrick said, I work at Stanford Law School where I teach and research privacy law and robotics. I tend to focus on the immediate commercial prospects of robotics, right? And so if you came here expecting a lecture about, say, Asimov's laws, or something along those nature, or when the robots are going to wake up and take over the world, this is not your lecture, because I actually talk about things that are happening right now or right around the corner. So for instance, I have a program with the School of Engineering that is, and the law school, that studies the legal aspects of driverless cars. And so we look at legal and policy hurdles to cars that drive themselves, and we do so in a thoroughly interdisciplinary way. My own work is about the intersection of privacy and robotics, as Dr. Lin said, but I also talk about other hurdles to robotics being deployed in the United States, like liability issues. What happens if you have a personal service robot in your house and it causes an injury? This is a sort of long tangent, but you'll see a few of those today, I think. But so you can't hear me?
It's going on and off.
The microphone's cutting in and out.
Okay.
Another placement. Bless you.
I'm gonna have to clip it to my bottom lip or something. Before, okay. Just make sure that this gets on. It's plugged in. I think we're good. Yeah, still cutting out a little bit. You know, why don't I switch to the other mic? How about that? Yeah. Hello? Is that better? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for pointing that out. I appreciate it, because I can't hear it from up here. Okay, so where was it? Liability. For instance, a couple of years ago, there was, people know the Roomba vacuum cleaner, right? People know that robotic vacuum cleaner. So the Roomba vacuum cleaner, a couple of years ago, there was this headline in an Israeli newspaper, and it said, "Hero robot saves family from poisonous snake." Right? Okay, there's this picture of like the Roomba, and in the Roomba's, little bottom part, there's this snake, this poisonous snake wrapped around the Roomba's, rotor, and it saved his family. And there's like a picture of like a 3-year-old girl that was in the house and that kind of thing, which is all well and good. But what happens if a Roomba sucks up, God forbid, a pet's tail? Right? And so these questions end up turning a lot on what are the current legal structures in place for product liability, and then also how does the design of the robot interact with that? Because if you have one kind of robotic system like the Roomba, well, it's easy to figure out who's at fault there, right? Because Roomba, it makes everything, iRobot makes everything about the Roomba. They make the hardware, they make the software, they license the software. The Roomba is a vacuum cleaner. It's supposed to do one thing and one thing safely, and that thing is vacuum your floor, not your pet's tail. And so if something goes wrong, it's super easy for us to point the finger at iRobot. You guys messed up. You made a product that's not safe in the way that's foreseeable, and so it's easy for the law to deal with it. But what happens if you have a sort of open robotic platform? In other words, a platform that maybe somebody designed the hardware, but like your iPhone, someone else wrote the app for it, right? And it has no initial dedicated purpose, so you can't say it's just for vacuuming the floor. It's for whatever cool thing you want to do with it, like a personal computer, right? And in that instance, you can do anything you want with it. And so actually, iRobot created a version of its Roomba called the Create. And the Create, and I swear we're going to get to privacy in a minute, but the Create actually is an open platform that anybody can do anything with. Now, raise your hand, and this always saddens me because it totally dates me, but raise your hand if you know about Frog. That old video. Oh, bless you guys. I guess at CalPoly, I'm in a better position here. So people took the Create and they put it in a little Frogger suit, okay, a little Froggy suit, and then they played live Frogger on the streets of Austin. Okay, so they programmed it to go out, and if there was a car, it would move back, or I guess an alligator or a log in subsequent versions of the game. But anyway, the point of the matter is that if you can do anything with it, who do you blame for that, right? Do you blame iRobot? iRobot says, well, look, we just built this thing for anybody to do anything. Do you blame the people that wrote the Frogger app? Do you blame the people that put it to this particular use? If it's open source software, then maybe there are multiple contributors. Anyway, this is one of the sort of fascinating questions I think that's presented by the law around liability. But today's talk, well, to come back to this, is about the implications of robotics for privacy. And as I said, I'd love to thank Dr. Lin and also the Ethics and Emerging Sciences group here for inviting me. Really exciting to do it. And also, one more plug. So a lot of this comes out of my book chapter in robot ethics, which has other really fabulous chapters in it as well, by a variety of people that are some of the leading robot ethicists and legal minds looking at this emerging technology. If you haven't checked it out, I would. So first of all, so this is a talk about robots and privacy. What do I mean by robots and what do I mean by privacy, right? I mean, I think a lot of you guys are coming from the philosophy track here, and you probably want to hear some definitions, right? And so I'm going to use a relatively common but not uncontroverted definition of robots, which says that they are able to sense, process, and act. Okay? So it turns out actually there's a robot in the audience. Can you spot him? Oh, you guys did. Okay, good. Not Steve. Steve is actually a real person. But there's a robot in the audience called Swivl. And if you can see what Swivl is this technology that allows you to record something. And this little bauble right here records audio. And then also allows Swivl to follow me around. So if I go over here, Swivl, light your heads, Swivl will look at me and it's actually plugged into an iPhone. So that counts, right? It counts because it senses the world around it, has the ability to sense. It does some processing. It has to sort of figure out where I am in the room and respond to that. And it actually moves in real time. So this definition, which actually comes out of Peter Singer's book, Wired for War, although Peter may have taken it from somewhere else, honestly. But anyway, this particular definition is meant to it's meant to distinguish robots from other kinds of technologies. So for instance, without the actuator, the ability to act upon the world, well then a laptop with a camera on it would be a robot, right? Or without the ability to do some processing, it doesn't have to be a lot, but the ability to sort of think about the world, then a remote control car with a camera on it would be a robot. And so this definition is meant to distinguish those two things. Honestly, because of what I'm going to say in a couple of minutes, I think that actually virtual robots, that is to say robots that have no material form and hence cannot act on the world in the sort of usual corporeal ways we think about it, that in some instances those ought to be thought about, and certainly they have an ethical dimension, which I'll touch upon a couple of times, but technically not robots under the definition of using. What's privacy? That is an impossible question to answer. Right? I mean, there's entire articles. One is a great one if you're interested in this topic called Conceptualizing Privacy by Dan Solow, or Dan Solow's Understanding Privacy, which is the book-length version of this particular insight. Walks through all the definitions that mankind has ever come up with around privacy, and basically, from like cave drawings saying, do not disturb or something, all the way to sort of contemporary sophisticated ideas about it. And says that each one is under or over-inclusive. It's not adequate. So basically, I'm going to be doing this kind of cheating. So I wrote a paper called Boundaries of Privacy Harm, where I talked about what I thought privacy harm was. And I said that it had two components. One was subjective or internal. And so the idea there is that this is the kind of discomfort we feel because someone's looking at you. Right? This is the perception of unwanted observation. It's the idea that you feel uncomfortable because of surveillance. And then the second, there's a lot more that goes into this, but then the second one is more of an external, extrinsic, objective kind of privacy harm, which is the idea that information about you is being used in some way against you, either in a way that's not anticipated, that you didn't know about or agree to, or that's coerced. And the reason that coerce is necessary is because sometimes you know quite well why someone is taking information from you, and you don't want them to use it in that way. One example of that is a famous case, not famous to you, famous to us lawyers, where somebody had their blood drawn, and it was going to be used to establish that they were a drunk driver. They know full well, they anticipate how the blood is going to be used, they don't want it, and therefore it is coerced. Does that make sense? Seeing a little bit of nodding? Good. Robot privacy. Okay. So, I think that robots, including drones incidentally, which we'll focus on a little bit today, I see robots as implicating privacy in essentially three ways. Okay? And the first way is by making it easier to do direct surveillance, vastly increasing our capacity for direct surveillance. And honestly, without any offense to Swivl, that's something what Swivl's doing, right? It's making observation of a certain kind, sort of beneficial kind, easier to do. Drones make surveillance much easier. They drive down the cost of surveillance, for instance, for police officers. So lots and lots of smaller police forces, presumably the one here and SLO, they don't necessarily have the resources to buy a helicopter. And to operate a helicopter, much less a plane. But they can buy a drone. The costs of operating a number of drones are lower. The cost of deploying them and training personnel are lower. And so usually what we see in surveillance technology is that as costs of something go down, the instances of it go up, and the incentives to do it go up. And so drones are going to make, used in the United States, it's going to mean much more surveillance, because it's cheaper. Does that make sense? So let me give you a little example of this. Is an officer going to go to everybody's house and find out whether the pool that they have is licensed or not licensed? I mean, technically they might be able to do that. They might be able to go to your house and knock on your door, ask your neighbors, whatever else it might be. But it's not going to invest the resources. It doesn't make any sense. But it'll be the afternoon work of a drone to fly over a neighborhood and autonomously match the pool with the license and the city records. And therefore, you see a lot more enforcement. Does that make a certain amount of sense? Okay. So this first slide, there's even slides. It's not just a big picture of my name. This first slide is a sort of go-to obligatory slide when it comes to robot and privacy talks. It's called the Hummingbird. I will show you a larger drone in a minute, but the Hummingbird is the defense, it's a cute, if military-funded technology that is built to resemble a hummingbird, and it's very small. And as you might be able to see right there, my little laser pointer, that is a camera, right? And so this is often pointed out, oh, these can be tiny little drones, and they can fly around and peep under our windows, and they may, but this is just one flavor of technology that could be used to increase capacity for surveillance, right? This is a wall climbing robot from SRI that uses static electricity to climb up walls. Why do you need to climb up the side of a building? There's another version of this technology out of Japan that climbs up windows, and it has a camera right in it, so that it's literally used for surveillance. The idea of this thing was to build it for surveillance purposes. One of my favorites is a new technology, not that new, I guess, at this point. It's been out for maybe, 14, 16 months, and it's a technique called jamming, okay? And jamming is where you have a robotic technology that's able to change different shapes and thereby squeeze itself into small spaces, or, for instance, under doors. Okay? Right. And then and again, these are all things that increase the capacity for surveillance. And I'll talk a little bit about why the law is, at present, not terribly well equipped to deal with it. This here is an example of a virtual agent. Kristen Thomason wrote this really cool paper for a conference recently that is all about robot interrogators. And the idea is that robots will be more efficient extractors of information from people because of a few different factors. And I see some sort of, this is where it gets a tiny bit creepy. Well, I guess if you weren't creeped out by the weird jamming, then you'll get creeped out. The idea is that robots will be more efficient at extracting information from people because they have sensors and they're able to process in real time and to sense things that ordinary people wouldn't be able to sense. So for instance, you could show someone a picture of a gun in an airport and then look at their brain scan and figure out whether or not they recognized it, or they'd seen one recently, right? Now this technology is not there yet, so people who claim that this is happening immediately for marketing purposes are overstating, but it is in theory the kind of thing where robotic technology is able to sort of immediately incorporate into a question and answer session, an interrogation, real-time data about what's happening, and therefore modulate its questions on the basis of that. And so the idea is, because if you think about it, like robots, they're perfect memory, they're tireless, they don't get embarrassed. I mean, they're just really good very efficient extractors of information. So why do I have this slide up? Well, this is actually a University of Arizona project that is called Avatar. And what Avatar is a kiosk that you would encounter on the way in, on the border, on the way in, and it asks you questions about what you do in the United States. And it watches points along your face and other things like perspiration, temperature, things like that, to see if you're getting nervous. Okay? And so it's supposed to be this sort of perfect border agent, if that makes sense. And so, again, this is all just to say that that robots have the capacity to change the surveillance dynamic and to vastly increase capacity for surveillance. It is not at all bad picture, right? I mean, using drones for cool, like sports photography, using drones to keep tabs on police, Swivl. I mean, there's lots of things where increasing our capacity for monitoring, for observation is actually quite a wonderful thing. and even actually liberty enhancing. So, do people know what the technique of kettling is? Has anyone heard that technique? So it's not a commonly known technique. Maybe you've heard of it. Yeah. So kettling is this technique where officers, and this is not a common technique, and it's very much frowned upon, and I don't mean to indicate that officers do this routinely, but there are situations where officers will, in a protest situation, will surround a crowd, kettle them, in essence, so that they're perfectly surrounded, that there's an unbreakable line of police around the crowd, and then they'll give the order to disperse, which is impossible, because they're completely surrounded. Does that make sense, right? It's an excuse by which to arrest protesters. Again, not a very nice practice. It's really, really hard to see if you're on the ground. Because all you see is the people around you and the officers in your immediate line of sight. It's really difficult for you to establish, gosh, I guess there are officers all around. All you know is you're running around and you're running amok, and you keep running into officers, and then you end up in a truck, and you have no way of establishing that you've been kettled. But of course, a $300 drone gives you a bird's eye view and lets you see that the officers are doing this, right? Women it's an endemic problem in the United States, an epidemic, I think, of women being harassed on the street. You know, I mean, I was walking with my wife in New York City, and we were walking in the East Village, and I bent down to tie my shoe, and she walked like 3-4 paces in front of me, and then all of a sudden the cat call started, right? What about a personal drone that basically will just like follow you home? Do you know what I mean? To enhance your security, to make sure people don't harass you. There are all kinds of really nice applications that are pro-liberty, that are in a sense pro-privacy, or at least pro-liberty of this technology. So I don't mean to say it's all bad. Okay. A second way that robotics implicates privacy is by granting greater access to historically private spaces like homes, offices, or cars. So what do I mean by that? Well, there is the possibility that, actually, no, okay, I'll start this way. So this is Tamara Denning. Can you guys see Tamara? I don't know why it says Walt Disney World. I think fancy robotics, I guess, but she's giving a talk. And Tamara and her colleagues at the University of Washington, Tadayoshi Kono's lab, wrote a paper where they show that it was relatively easy to hack into commercially available robots that you have in your house. So the idea is you buy a robot like the Rovio, for instance, that just kind of runs around, and it connects to the internet, allowing you to use it from download software to use it remotely and the like. And what they were able to show is that, number one, these robots have a unique internet signature, and number two, they're really, really easy to hack. And so the idea is that they could pull up into a driveway, see whether any robots were online, differentiate robot wireless traffic from other kinds of traffic, and relatively efficiently take over the robot. That meant that they could see what the robot can see, the interior of the house, and they could hear what the robot can hear, again, your conversation in your house, without really much in the way of trouble. You could do that with a baby monitor. What's different in part about the robot, and another thing that Tamara and her colleagues showed, was that they were also able to take over and manipulate the robot itself, even working in tandem with other robots in the house. And so that, for instance, they could like go and look at stuff in the house, you know, like sort of pick something up. They could drop your spare keys out of the mailbox, you know what I mean? Like those kinds of tasks. So the idea is that you have this robot that's in your house, and you believe that your house is a sacred and intimate place that no one can access, and suddenly it's possible for people to hack into this thing, right? And that's going to be an increasingly large concern. They've also hacked like smart cars. They've hacked all kinds of really interesting stuff over there at that lab. This is a headline from a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, where insurgents in Afghanistan, it was in Iraq. Insurgents in Iraq were able to hack into the video that the U.S. military drones were able to do. And so even like, military technology that's used for surveillance. They went and found these people's laptops, and they had footage from our military drones on their laptops, and then they figured out that they used sort of off-the-shelf software and hardware in order to hack into this technology. Now, one interesting thing to know about the law is that there's always this fight over whether the government needs a warrant for something. You know, the government needs a warrant to listen to your phone call, but do they need a warrant to follow you around using your GPS device, right? They need a warrant to search your house. Do they need a warrant to get a dog to sniff your house to see whether you're growing marijuana? These are some live questions right now in the law. And the idea always is about, do they need a warrant? Do they need a warrant? What does that mean? It just means that they have to go to a judge and present some evidence and say, this is why we want to do what we're going to do. And then the magistrate judge or the judge says yes or no, and then signs this warrant and has to specifically delineate what you're going to do. Now, that's some process, but having overcome that hurdle, they can get anything. They can get anything. There are no extrinsic limits on what they can get, other than the fact that they have to go to a judge to get it. And so if robots are, with their sensory equipment, with their audio, with their visual capabilities, are in our homes, are in our offices, are in our cars, with a warrant, and sometimes with a lot less than a warrant, officers will be able to do that. So in other words, officers could do a search, remote search of your house, if you have a robot in it, right? In one instance, they got a warrant, officers got a warrant, and they were able to turn on a microphone in a gangster's car that was from OnStar. So you know OnStar, where it's like, how can I help you, whatever. The officers went to OnStar, presented a warrant, and then turned on surreptitiously this thing. So I just want you to understand that the fact that you have to give a warrant for something is not dispositive of whether it's going to be creepy from a privacy perspective. And so as we invite robots into our homes and cars and offices and the like, we have to think about whether they give access in terms of the ability to see and hear to places that historically been private. Okay? Okay. All right, so there's a sense in which these first two aspects, direct surveillance and access, actually admit of legal and technical solutions. Does that make sense? Right? So if we're worried about overuse of drones, maybe you need a warrant to follow somebody around with a drone. Maybe you set policies of the police saying you can't fly around the neighborhood looking for something that's trivial, like whether you have a license for your pool. Right now, it turns out officers can just fly around with drones and look at anything, including your backyard, basically anything that they can see from a public vantage. And for the most part, the law doesn't have anything to say about that. But we could correct the law from that perspective. We could update the law to reflect this new dynamic. Security. The Federal Trade Commission, which is this consumer and market-oriented federal agency, actually brings enforcement actions against entities that don't have very good security. So in one instance, the DSW case, like DSW shoes, amazingly, they had these wirelessly connected registers that were in the clear. So you could drive up into a DSW a parking lot and just see people's credit card numbers just out in the clear, and the FTC was like, seriously? And so they brought this consent decree against them, and they required that they have adequate security, and then not having adequate security was a violation of what's called was unfair under statutory definition. So the idea is that the government is in a position to require incentivize adequate security. So they could go to roboticists and say, these things are in kids' rooms, like get real about the security, right? They could build military drones that you can't hack with a Radio Shack. You know what I mean? So there's ways for us to sort of address these first two concerns about surveillance and about access, I think. And there's more examples of that. Another example is, you guys may not know this, but Twitter, when it first came out, did not have adequate security according to the Federal Trade Commission. And it was growing so fast that the FTC went to Twitter and said, we're gonna have to make an agreement with you guys that lasts 20 years, saying that we're gonna be able to audit your security because your security isn't good enough. So this is something that happens very routinely. There's a case that was just decided by the Supreme Court. It's called the Jones case. It's a case involving whether the FBI, whether police can follow you in the car using a GPS device, where the police said, even though, where the Supreme Court said, even though technically you can follow somebody around in their car all the time with your squad car, you can have a team following people around. You can't just throw a GPS device on their car and follow them around wherever they go that way and build a case against them. In part, 5 justices thought it was too easy. They were worried about the capacity for electronic surveillance. So the point of it is you can do things in the law. Query whether that case, the Jones case involving affixing a GPS to a car, whether that actually implicates drones, because technically what the Supreme Court said in Jones was that you have to get a warrant in order to trespass on someone's vehicle by affixing a GPS device. This is a very common practice. There were situations where people would find a GPS device in a car, and they would blog about it, and then all of a sudden it would be the FBI, and the FBI would be like, yeah, can we get that GPS device back? Because we're going to use it again. So this is a very random practice, and in fact the FBI had turned off thousands of GPS devices in the wake of the Jones case. But you don't have to affix a drone to anything. A drone can follow a car around without having to be attached to it, so one wonders whether that limit's in place. But the basic point is you could do that. But I'm going to talk about one last way in which robots implicate privacy that I think actually presents deeper philosophical and legal challenges. Okay. So, study after study shows that we are hardwired to react to technology that looks like a person, anthropomorphic technology, voices, faces, as though there really were a person. It's like, on some accounts, it is like biologically hardwired that when we see something that looks like a face, we just figure that like at some deep, sort of physiological level almost, we respond as though a person really there. So consider this study. So this is a study where scientists had coffee that you had to pay on the honor system, and some weeks they put a picture of flowers over the coffee, and some weeks they put a picture of eyes over the coffee. And they found that people would pay for coffee more often on the honor system when there were eyes over the collection basket than when there were flowers. Which makes sense, right? I mean, I don't know, number 5 kind of looks like, I guess if they're like Voldemort eyes or whatever, then I think I'd be slightly more concerned about it. But even like any of these eyes, and even sort of like Benjamin from 7 over here, led people to pay more often on the honor system. And there's study after study that shows that this is the case. This is this hardwired reaction, not just to eyes, but to faces, to voices, and the like. Okay, so this is Nexi from MIT's Media Lab. What's happening is that roboticists want to leverage the fact that we're so predisposed to treat robots as though they were people, because it allows them to make things that are much more salient to us, much more interesting and intriguing, and really bring this in. By the way, it didn't take much. I mean, remember the Roomba I talked about before? Like, people bring their Roombas on play dates. And this is just a little, circular disc that goes around. So, much less something like this, which is built on purpose to be deeply anthropomorphic. Again, in order to grab our attention. Okay, so, this tendency to treat anthropomorphic technology as though it were really a person extends to the feeling of being observed and evaluated, as perhaps the coffee study suggests, but many other studies will suggest this as well. I've done studies showing that people will modulate what they disclose on the basis of whether or not the thing asking the question looks like a person versus not like a person. And there are studies that show this again and again. So imagine that you have Nexi in your house. This is, whatever, 15 years from now, and you have Nexi in your house, and you do something that you do ordinarily, but that is a little weird. Everybody has something a little weird about them that they do, right? And so maybe not you guys, but me. And so you do something in your house that's like totally weird, and this is the reaction that you get. Right? Can you feel that? Right? I mean, that's a plastic and metal. That is not a person, right? But next to these programs will react like a person. And the question becomes, I think the interesting question to me is, does it matter that this robot has social meaning to us? It has a valence to us that is in some sense about our interactions with people. Again, it's not limited to, I'll take the next view right here. It's not limited to faces or eyes. This is also very true of speech. So we're like really wired for speech, as Cliff Nass said in this great book about. So we tend to really change, like even we actually enter a state of what's called psychological arousal, which is just being sounds dirty. It's actually being in the presence of another person from just the mere introduction of a voice. And so I had occasion to go to Microsoft's Home of the Future. And what Microsoft's Home of the Future is this awesome, basically like this big corporate offices, and then there's like this weird house at Microsoft, okay? And you go to the house, and it's like all the cool things that are going to happen in the future. And so it's like you can open the door with your iPhone app, and you can make people go away by faking a dog barking. And you can do all this cool stuff. And there's all these new monitors. Anyway, one really cool thing about the Home of the Future is that if you put some in one of the demos, if you put some stuff like a bag of flour or whatever, milk, onto the tabletop and the countertop in the kitchen, all of a sudden the light changes and there's this voice, and it's Grace, right? And Grace says, "It looks like you're trying to bake a cake. Do you want any help with that?" You know? And you're like, "Oh yeah, thanks, Grace. I'm not very good at baking. I'd love some help." And then Grace will like project a recipe step by step onto the counter, right? But as I said before, we're not always baking cakes, And the feeling that you have this disembodied anthropomorphic entity in your house in the future, if you think about it, is weird, right? And it's going to feel like something to you. And so the question I have about this is, does the introduction of more and more social interfaces, what does it do for our dwindling opportunities for solitude in the car, in the home, in the house, right? I think another interesting aspect of this is, nobody really cares how you interact with your ordinary appliances. I don't care when you do your dishes, how often you do your dishes, whether you use the heat dryer or not. I guess if you were really sort of environmentally conscious, you frown upon that sort of thing. But the way that you interact with a robotic companion feels to you like a person, that is going to create a category of information that has social meaning, and meanwhile it's being recorded and processed. The way that you interact with a robotic companion could read like it would be like something that a psychologist would love to get their hands on, because it is a sense of what we're projecting onto how you want to use it, right? And so it's something I call settings privacy in the paper. This doesn't have to be about robots exclusively. Imagine the way in which your search transactions are mediated, right? So the idea is that when you search for something on Google, it's a relatively simple transaction. You write in, some text, and you get a bunch of links back, right? I mean, it's pretty. Even though there's some data collection going on there, it doesn't really feel like much to you. It just feels like a pretty straightforward transaction. That's all changing. This is from a couple of years ago. It's called Miss Dewey. Do people know Miss Dewey? Probably missed that one. So Miss Dewey was a promotion that Microsoft ran a few years ago when it was trying to get into search. And what it was is a fully anthropomorphic search engine. So she is not static. She's static here, obviously, but she's like fully anthropomorphic, video feed. And instead of basically putting in something like shoes in Menlo Park, you basically ask her a question. You say, "Miss Dewey, just tell me." And she's like, "This sexy librarian." Right? And then she reacts to your searches. In fact, if you wait too long when you're on the search engine, Miss Dewey will lean forward and tap on your monitor and say, hey, I don't have all day here, right? Does it feel the same to search for something? Hemorrhoid treatment, right? When it's a sexy librarian versus a Google. And when I first started thinking about this, I wrote this paper called People Can Be So Fake. It was about the repercussions of this anthropomorphic technology. I had to go and find this crazy pants example where I wanted to show this is going to be the future of search. It's going to be so weird. You know, it's going to be like this little personal assistant in your pocket. And I went to that same company that made the wall climber before, SRI, and I talked about their artificial intelligence personal assistant called Siri and how crazy and futuristic that was. And then the next year, it rolls out with the iPhone 4. It's actually a problem that plagues those of us who talk about emerging technology and ethics and policies. Like, we can't even come up with examples that are crazy enough because somebody builds them like a few minutes later. All right, so. So how should we think about the social meaning aspect, unlike the access and the surveillance? How should we think about social meaning? One thing about privacy law, and I can't give you too much of it to develop this too far, but one thing about it is that it tends to be that notice and consent tend to defeat most kinds of things. So for instance, your employer can put cameras around the office as long as they tell you that they're putting cameras around the office. That makes sense? Or your employer can monitor your emails as long as there's a handbook that says we monitor your emails. Or a company can share your email with a third party as long as they tell you in a privacy policy that they're going to do that. And the idea is that you have to have some notice about what's happening, you have to be able to agree to it to some extent, but that's the whole ballgame. It tends to really defeat a legal claim if you have notice and choice, broadly speaking. But not only do we invite the social meaning into our lives, we actually pay big money for it. And the effects are subtle about what you might search for, what you might do, how comfortable you are in your private spaces. They're not something that the law is terribly well equipped to deal with. I think that the story is not all bad, because this problem is also a potential solution, a potential feature. This bug is a potential feature, I guess. And that's because often robots are collecting information actually. And so maybe when they do, it should feel like they are. And so in other words, the more information a robot collects, perhaps the more anthropomorphic it should be. This is a concept that I call visceral notice. And the idea of visceral notice is that you actually feel and experience the data collection as opposed to reading about it in some privacy policy. Let me try to give you a concrete example of that. So this is Intel's home exploring robotic butler, or HERB, okay? And, HERB is not terribly anthropomorphic. It doesn't take much, but as robots go, it just looks like, a basic platform with an actuator. But of course it does have multiple cameras and laser range finding and a lot of other stuff. Today, HERB would come with a Kinect, which is for your Microsoft Kinect for your Xbox, which doesn't hardly look like a camera at all. It just looks like a ledge, right? A lot of data is being collected. The question is, we might be able to ask ourselves, is HERB anthropomorphic enough, right? The other thing I think is interesting, and I promised you one picture of a drone, is the reactions that we have, the social meaning that these technologies have to us, could lead us to actually care more about privacy than we have before. So bear with me for one moment. A lot of privacy violations are going on today that are extremely hard to picture or conceptualize. Like, what does a privacy harm look like today in the day of big data, databases, right? The idea is that one piece of information from here is being correlated with another piece of information over here in some server somewhere, and then spitting out some decision in some way, and maybe you're appearing on some watch list, but it's really difficult for you to picture it, And so it's really hard for you to sort of, have a visceral response to what's happening to you. And then I mentioned before that there's this thing about privacy law, which is that you don't really have a reasonable expectation of privacy if you're in public or if you're viewable from a public vantage. So even from in your backyard, the officers can see you from some places they're allowed to be in the air. That's fair game. And that has persisted for long, long periods of time. The notion that you have no privacy in public. And it's even persisted in an age where we have tons and tons of video cameras that are all over the place now, right? But again, it just doesn't feel to you that much like I've forgotten about Swivl. It doesn't feel to you too much like you're really being surveilled. You don't get that visceral reaction to it. And so even in London, where CCTV is absolutely pervasive, the pushback is actually relatively minimal. But of course, then London says, we're going to fly drones for the Olympics. And people start to freak out. Similarly, in the United States, we hear more and more accounts of how the Federal Aviation Administration is going to open up the nation's airways to drones. Well, look at the thing. Look at that thing. Right? I mean, it is this inscrutable, metal, flying robot that's watching over you. It has a valence. We tend to associate drones with the theater of war, specifically with targeted killing, even though most 95% or more of what they do is actually surveillance. They are loaded for us. They have a meaning to us. And as a result, I don't think that a lot of aspects of privacy law are going to survive the domestic use of drones. If you see lots of drones being used domestically, I find it to be very unlikely that we are going to tolerate it. And we're already starting to see this. I talk to staffers on the Hill, that is to say, people who work for representatives, congressmen, senators. I talk to the privacy advocacy community, and there's a lot of traction around the idea of whether we're out of it. I think that's what this artist is getting at in Manhattan, who put up signs all over Manhattan saying that local statutes are enforced by drone. Why did he do this? He did it because he knew that it would have this valence to us. Like, gosh, oh my goodness, we become this sort of totalitarian state. So in other words, the fact that we freak out about robots may ultimately be good for privacy. So it's a mixed picture from that point, right? And in some places, the intersection of robotics and policy and ethics is going to be very, very difficult for us to absorb. And I think particularly interesting is this idea of social meaning, but there's also opportunity there. How to notify people better about the fact that their data is being collected and how to improve and enhance the privacy protections that we have today, which are frankly not adequate up to the task of emerging technology. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. This is from Time magazine. There's a picture of the sort of robots are coming and the kids are crying. If you guys want to hear more about this issue, please by all means email me. That's my email address right there. I get back to people very fast. That is our website, cyberlaw.stanford.edu, where we have a whole thing about robots and stuff going about drones. And that's me on Twitter. So I just want to say, thanks again for listening, and I'm very happy to hear your questions. Does anybody have any questions? I'm happy to. Yeah, over there.
So why is it that, I'm trying to find a way to form the question, we humans would prefer to be maybe